Hi everyone, it's Katie from Moonflower Moments. You'll have to excuse the scratches that are on my hand. We just got a kitten yesterday, so he's still, he's just really adorable to play with, but he definitely can scratch pretty hard. So I'm going to go ahead and do a video response to Maureen at the Waves of Your Soul Tarot titled One Deck Per Arcana. So the basic idea of this is to pick a deck that embodies every major card's energy. So if you pick a deck, it embodies like the Fool's energy. So it's not that you want to pick like a deck that has your favorite Fool card, that's a totally different tag, but a deck that embodies the overall energy and the overall vibes of the particular major overall. So now that I've explained that, I'm going to jump into my Fool Tarot deck. So this is the deck that embodies the Fool for me. I call it Corte, but if you want the full name, it's right here, written on the back of the cards. I just realized that this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and say that Corte is my Fool's Tarot because it doesn't come with any like little white guidebook. And there isn't a lot of information online about how you're supposed to read this deck. Are you supposed to read it with pips? Are you supposed to read it as Marseille? Are you supposed to read it as RWS? There's really no telling. So I come to this deck every time I read with it as a Fool, and I'm willing to let this deck tell me how it's going to be read. So it has that versatility and that adaptability that I think is innate to the Fool. And I think that its open-mindedness and my willingness to play with the systems when I interact with this deck make it the perfect Fool Tarot deck for me. I also like that it's a deck that not a lot of people like mention and talk about because I find myself not being influenced by other people's opinion. So it really gives me a place to come to it and have my own Fool's journey of the sorts as I work through my tarot readings. So Corte is my Fool's Tarot deck. So next I'm going to move on to the Magician. And my Magician deck is going to be my Tarot Botanical Tarot. You can purchase this on Etsy. So I'll leave a link down below for you. So this was the first deck that I ever purchased. And I remember sitting down and doing the reading, and I took a picture of the first reading that I ever did. I didn't know anything about tarot at the time, but I knew that this was going to be something that radically transformed my life. And I think that that innate association with this being my first deck and something that felt so incredibly powerful at that moment makes this my ultimate Magician's deck. So I use this deck when I am doing very serious readings, when I'm doing ancestor readings, when I'm doing ritual work. And so it's the deck that I know that I can call on to give me guidance, whether that be from above or below. I feel like it's very tapped into the collective unconsciousness. And I think that its black and white nature allows me the space to move on in and experience my own personal power when working with this deck. I do feel like it has the capacity to help me to manifest, and it's just an incredibly magical deck. I also like the fact that it's pips because, like I already established, I like to read with those because it allows me the space to come into it with all of my tarot understanding, so everything that I've learned from other decks and everything that I've learned from books that I've read, and to be able to interpret the card through the lens of my collective and cumulative learning. So it reminds me of my personal power and taps me into the above and the below. So for that reason, Tarot Botanical is going to be my mage deck. And this is the back too, if you'd like to see. I love the backs. Next is going to be the High Priestess deck. So this is Witch Sisters. Ooh, a very slippery Witch Sisters. So Witch Sisters is my High Priestess deck because it is primarily female-centric. I like the fact that we have older figures here as well, so it reminds me of the ability of the High Priestess to call on just a very long strand of knowledge, right? Like the High Priestess is not just calling on her own experience, but also the experiences of those that came before her and the lineage of just the cumulative knowledge overall. And so I like the fact that we have some figures that are older and figures that are a little bit more worn, because I do feel like the High Priestess is someone who is connecting to more than just herself. And so the depictions of all of these different women give that roundabout impression of the High Priestess. Every time I work with this deck, I will say that I'm always rewarded by the experience, but it's not a deck that I whip out for very short readings. It's something that I like to take my time with, because like the High Priestess, she's willing to give you, well, I take that back. Like the High Priestess, she's willing to guide you in the right direction, but she's not willing to give you anything. You really have to work for it. She holds that scroll close to her chest, that knowledge close to her chest. And if you want to be able to tap into it, you have to be willing to do the work with it. And I think that's how this deck works, since it isn't an RWS, and it really isn't anything like numerically like any of the other decks that I own. So for its raw feminine power and the fact it holds many secrets, this is going to be my High Priestess deck. This is Witch Sisters. So next I'm going to pull my Empress deck, and that would be Slavic Legends. So Slavic Legends, I've said before in my Decks for Court series, the Pentacle Edition, this deck reminds me of the Queen of Pentacles, and that always innately reminds me of the Empress as well. So I like that in every single card we have a lot of lush greenery. Oops. Oh, look, that's a great example of it. Lush greenery. And that nothing is really pared back. The saturation is hit to its highest. And that, of course, reminds me of the Empress, because if you look at the world, the Empress is the one that creates the world. She's the one who nurtures the world, and she creates the garden. And so everything is lush and green around her and just filled with possibilities. And so because I think of her that way, the imagery in this deck innately reminds me of her. So we'll stop at the Queen of Cups, because I think this is a great example of that lush energy. So Slavic Legends is going to be my Empress deck. So I've mentioned before that I think that the Empress is someone who with the ability to create the lushness. So we naturally need the Emperor to impose discipline and impose structure to be able to make everything orderly and accessible, right? Like if you have a garden that doesn't have any structure or any pathways, you're really not going to get very far in terms of walking within that garden. So I have some, I guess we have reversals mixed in. That's actually very funny for the Emperor and not very like him at all. So I think CBD reminds me the most of the Emperor, because this is a deck that I go to for clean, straight-shooted advice. So it is as traditional of a Marseille as you can get. So when you sit down to seek an answer from it, it's going to give you the answer, and it's going to tell it to you in a very straightforward capacity. And that reminds me so much of the Emperor, because while the Empress is producing this lush garden, the Emperor is someone that's building the boardwalks and building the path so that you can access it. So when your life gets full and it's overwhelmed and overstimulated through the Empress, and you have too much going on, the Emperor is someone that's able to cut right through that and to give that creation room so that you can explore it. So the CBD Tarot, one of my absolute favorites. I know that there's nothing special, quote unquote, about this deck in terms of the fact it's just like your standard traditional Marseille, but I have such a deep relationship with it because of its Emperor nature. So next is going to be the Hierophant. And Southern Botanic is going to be my Hierophant deck. So where I'm at in South Louisiana, there is a history of healers known as traitors that use herbal plant medicine to heal people, especially in the rural areas, along with Catholicism and prayer to the saints and veneration of them, etc., etc. And so Southern Botanic taps me into that Hierophant energy because it reminds me of the people that came before me that are living in this area that were able to heal others with plants. And so because these plants hold that healing knowledge, and same with the traitors that live in this area, it makes me want to go seek out that knowledge from them and from the plants to be able to build my own repertoire and eventually become competent in this skill as well. So the Hierophant is the thing that holds me, it holds the knowledge that I seek, and for that reason I'm going to have to vote the Southern Botanic as my Hierophant deck. Alright, next is going to be the Lovers. So I have the Klimt Tarot here. So when I think of Lovers, I do typically tend to read it as more of a commitment than the romantic aspects of it, though I think the Klimt Tarot demonstrates both of them. So some of the cards in this deck really do show the depth of that commitment requires. So I'm going to go ahead and see if we can find one. There's a couple cards that I'm thinking of in general. Oh, here we go, right on top. So the Two of Swords really does remind me of the Lovers. So you can see here that we have two people that are embracing one another, and it looks like their relationship or their lives are going through a tumultuous time, and so they really rely on that commitment to be together, but there might be anguish through that process. So from this card, I definitely see the difficulty of the decision with the Two of Swords to continue this relationship and to stay committed. And I think that that brings in the heaviness of the Lovers that I look for when I'm reading the Lovers in general. And there are a lot of other different cards that depict that as well. But you also have like this sweet sensuality for like the romanticism as well. So this is the Four of Swords, and usually, of course, that is a card that can denote like rest, but it can also denote illness. She looks just as happy as can be, laying her head against her hands like that. And so it has that softer sense of romance as well. Same with the Sun right here. Clearly this is a couple that loves each other so much that, but it almost looks to me as if that level of commitment is so strong they want to like climb into each other's skin. So the way that people are depicted in here, they're clearly very interwoven with each other, showing that commitment and showing the depth of that. And so for that reason, the Klimt Tarot is going to be my Lovers deck. I also know that Lovers is associated with Gemini, and I associate this deck heavily with Gemini as well because of the ways that this deck departs from traditional imagery. It reminds me of all of the intuitive hits that represent Gemini. I think Gemini is a sign that is able to sink into like the stream of consciousness very easily, and they're able to engage with intuitive hits very easily. So the places where this imagery departs from standard also make it a Gemini deck and thus a Lovers deck. And when I think of the Chariot, I can't help but think of the William Blake Tarot. So the Chariot is associated with Cancer. And so when I think about that, I think of the fact that Cancer, its symbol is a crab with very hard shell, but then once you dive into it and you get past all the pokey bits and all the clawy bits, you end up with something that's like really raw and vulnerable. And so I think that the William Blake is a great example of that, because when it comes down to it, it has a hard shell with some images that people find difficult to bear and work with. But when you get to know it and you peel back all of those layers, it has a level of vulnerability and rawness that I think someone who is a Cancer, such as myself, would really love and crave and gravitate towards. It also reminds me of the Chariot's determination, because this deck is a deck that is wholeheartedly itself. So the Chariot is the first time we get to see the Fool interacting by himself. So in, of course, 1 through 5, he's interacting with mentors, and then in 6, he has a friend or a lover to interact with. And so this is the first time that he's going out by himself. So I also wanted to pick a deck for this that had a keen sense of self. And I think that's what this deck is. It doesn't pretend to be anything else. It even switches up some of the suits. So this is music, even though it has fire on the outside, this is actually a water card. It doesn't care. You know, it is going to assert itself in this world and be who it's meant to be. So for its hard shell but rawness and its like clear sense of who it is, I'm gonna go ahead and pick this one for my Chariot deck, and this is William Blake. Next is going to be my Strength deck, and I'm going to go ahead and pick Wildwood for this one. So especially working with the guidebook for Wildwood, there are very clear indications in the guidebook and throughout the deck that demonstrate that animals are just as valid and wholesome of creatures as humans are. And as someone whose beliefs tend to be very druidic, that really aligns with my personal philosophy. But it reminds me of the Strength, because oftentimes with the Strength card, you're not trying to beat that creature down. You're trying to make amends with it, and you're trying to live side by side with those urges and those instincts that are living within you. And I think that this deck, especially with the Court cards being represented by animals, it of course represents strength, because ultimately when it comes down to it, we are living side by side with them. We've made our peace. Like here we have the archer. She clearly has these wolves behind her as she's shooting, and she's comfortable with them. And so the Wildwood Tarot is going to be my strength card because of the way it depicts animals and also humans side by side in an ideal world. Next would be Hermit. And for this one I picked Tabula Mundi. So a lot of times when I think of the Hermit card, I also think of its association with Virgo. So Virgo to me is someone that's very studious and very meticulous. And so I think that that's why I gravitate towards this for the Hermit, because this is a deck that is so deeply esoteric in nature that you can study it for years and still have more to learn. So it is a Thoth-based deck, so of course it is built in with like the Tree of Life, which in itself is of course something that takes years and years and years of studying to really get a grasp on. And so I think the depth of this knowledge, how you have to go within yourself and really be willing to put in the work and the time to study, reminds me of the Hermit for that reason. So this is Tabula Mundi with by far some of the most beautiful backs of all time. So for my wheel deck, I'm going to go ahead and choose Serpent and Peacock, the first edition. So when I think of the wheel, I think of the changes in our lives and what we make of them. So I really like this deck because of the way that characters are depicted interacting with imagery that is not traditional. So within most of the cards in particular, there's this concept that nothing is really going to remain the same. So through that non-traditional imagery, it brings forth the wheel, because the wheel is constantly turning. So for example, here with the Two of Cups, we have two people that are engaged in love, but we also have Lilith who's down below. So there's this sense that perhaps they're living in this ideal peace, but at what cost, and is it going to stay that way? So it's not true for every single card, but it is true for plenty of them. So for example, we have here, there's a card that I'm looking for that I know is closer to the top of the deck. So I'm going to scoot to where we get it. So here in the Chariot, there is this sense that this person is running towards battle, but instead of like that usual victory of the Chariot, we have these dark and gloomy skies here. So how is this person going to cope with the fact that they're about to make decisions that are dangerous, that things are about to happen to them that are outside of their control? Its imagery is also so sporadic that it's almost like, what is the wheel going to pop out next? So this is a great example of it as the Magician. It brings in that trickster energy of this goose honking this man's face. Like, what is the wheel going to bring in next? And are you going to be someone who handles this with a straight face, or you're going to be someone who freaks out about it? So it really calls into mind for me the ways that we're going to react to what's going on around us. This is another great example of, like, you have Judgment, which is traditionally an image that is a positive one because you're getting called to a higher purpose in life, but yet this hand is like bleeding significantly. So it almost gives this idea of it's time to move on to that greater purpose, but what are you costing yourself? Like, at what cost? So, you know, what are the consequences of your actions and your decisions? And are you prepared for whatever comes next on the wheel, such as this Tower? So Serpent Peacock is going to be my wheel deck for that reason. Next is going to be my Justice deck. And it always and forever will be Tarot, the Zombie Tarot. So I know that's a bold claim to make, but it makes sense if you understand my usage of this deck. So I've mentioned before that I use this deck for interpersonal readings because of the way that the pentacles are depicted. So the pentacles are the hazards. And so essentially this person has trained the zombie to cut his grass by like dangling the stake in front of him. So it explores power dynamics and social dynamics unlike anything other. And so when I'm sitting down and reading with this deck, I really get a fair sense of who is doing who harm and what are the consequences going to be for those actions. So it embodies the justice energy in that way, because I know that I don't go to this deck to lie to me. If I'm in the wrong and I am treating someone unfairly or taking advantage of them, this deck is able to call me out from those actions and demand that I do better in a very justice way, mostly because of the way, like I said, that the hazards suit is depicted of the zombies being trained. So zombies is my justice deck. So my Hanged Man deck is going to be my Bug Tarot. So there is something to be said about seeing the world from a different perspective. And I think that we become much more well-rounded creatures and just more empathetic in general when we look at how the creatures around us live. And so I like that this deck gives a different perspective within the majors. All of them are depicted as a particular type of bug, because it makes you imagine, if I was this particular bug going on this particular challenge, how would I get through this? How would I feel knowing that a lot of people consider me to be insignificant? I also like the pips too. They embody that Hanged Man energy, because when I first read with them, I really did think that they were lazy pips. And then something happened in my head that made me understand them really, really well. So this is like the Six of Cups, and you have this one little mushroom that's standing over here to the side, or you can even say this one little mushroom right here, this tiny one. So this is the child. And all of the other influences that are around him are essentially dripping onto him. So he's the child that's being influenced by everything around him in that Six of Cups way. So like I mentioned before, you know, I don't read with this deck enough to know just like that interpretation I gave off the fly. It took a while for me to unlock this deck. And then once I was willing to listen to what it had to tell me about this Two of Cups and these two mushrooms being connected, and essentially love being connected through the mycelium, so the deepest layers of who we are, it really opened my eyes to a new perspective and made me see tarot, but also the world in a different way. So the Hanged Man is going to be the Bug Tarot for me. Next is going to be Death, and that will be my Illusori Tarot. So one thing that you're going to notice right away from this deck is that everyone's eyes are closed. So I think that that is representative of death itself, because you're no longer seeing from this particular body. Most of the heads, as a matter of fact, you really don't see much of the rest of the body. Maybe the hands, you can sometimes see a little bit of the hands, but like it even has a question mark here, like who is that body, right? So it's essentially a head that's going on this adventure, waiting for that next adventure. While this deck does have bright colors, I don't really see this as a fire deck. I see this as a water deck because of the ways that the colors blend into each other. It reminds me of that transformational process that exists within death and moving on to the next journey. I think that all of the people, all of the spirits that are depicted here are ready and willing to move into the next dimension. And so for that reason, the Illusori Tarot is going to be my death deck. And here are the backs if you'd like to see them. We even have someone, oh, this one is the only person who has their eyes open. Oh, that's crazy. It's on the back. Huh. Hold up, I gotta think about that. Yeah, that's really neat. I feel like that I can bring that into my death interpretation some way, but that's gonna be for a time after I journal about it. So next is going to be my Temperance deck. So after you've embodied or embarked on this journey, after you've died, you're no longer connected with your body. You're connected with the vibrations that are larger than you. There's no illusion of separation between you and the rest of the consciousness of the world. And so for that reason, I'm going to go ahead and pick the Gentle Tarot, because this is a deck that is deeply in tune with the world around it and the spirit around it. Mari actually has an extra card in this deck, and I'm blanking on what it's called. I think it's called The Unknown. And she describes in the guidebook about how she drew that card as the 22nd major, or really the 23rd if you count the Fool, because of a near-death experience that she had and what she experienced after going through that near-death experience. And so I find that that relates a lot to the Temperance as well, because on the edge of Temperance is this guardian angel or this guide that's willing to help you through this spiritual journey after you've died. And I think that Mari, in a sense, because she's had that experience herself of going through that near-death experience, I think that that energy is embodied into this deck as something that is calm and healing and is willing to hold your hand as you're going through these major changes and moving on to the next part of your being and the next part of your calling. So I'm going to leave that be for Temperance. The Gentle Tarot is my Temperance deck. Next is going to be my Devil deck. Now, I'm sure that this is going to be one that other people use for this, but it's of course going to be my Somnia. So I've been recently using this deck to do a lot of shadow spreads that are inspired by a book that I'm reading that is very melancholy in nature. And it just reminded me time and time after again that this deck is not one that is meant to be taken at straight face value. Even though it looks like it's an RW-esque, it really likes to be played with spreads that are more figurative in nature. It blows my socks off every time I read with it in that way, because, you know, it really does add that extra layer of meaning. So this deck I particularly consecrated for shadow work. It is like my official shadow work deck in that way. So if I want to engage in shadow work practices, this is the one that I turn to. But of course, if, you know, other decks, once, you know, I find myself doing shadow work with the other decks too, that's fine. But this is the one that I go to for that purpose, and I try not to stray for it, to keep it in that ritualesque and very honorific place. So Somnia does call out my dark side, and it holds me accountable, and it reminds me of all of the ways that I can improve, but also ways that I'm hiding my true self from the world. And so Somnia is going to be my Devil deck. Once again, I bet a lot of people are going to choose it for the Devil. It is such a great deck for it. So I can see why people are on the fence about whether or not to get this one, because I know for some people the shrouds can be very scary, but it works well as a shadow deck for me. So I read the Tower in a very esoteric sense, because I did study like the pictorial key when I was first starting to read tarot, and the Barbara Walker most closely fits my definition of the Tower. So I tend to not think of the Tower as like a physical change or a physical form of destruction, but rather an internal destruction of the ego itself. So after we go through the process of death, we face our demons in the Devil card one last time, so to speak. And then in the Tower, we really do experience that shattering of ourself, or that shattering of ego. So Barbara Walker most closely reminds me of this because of the fact that most of the cards, there's just one person. And the keywords tend to be very confrontational, and the imagery tends to be very confrontational. So after you've gone through the Devil, per se, you might still be holding on to some of these messaging from your childhood. And so to get a card like this, which is this person that's looking up into this large figure of their childhood, this is something that could test your sense of self and essentially be very confrontational to you. So Barbara Walker is my Tower deck since she's able to pack that punch like Tower cards are able to, but because she also reminds me that my journey is very, is one where I have to intentionally break or, you know, essentially break myself in order to progress to the next level and to see the starlight of the next card. So hopefully that wasn't too vague, but Barbara Walker is my tower deck. Lovingly, I call her my bitch of a deck because she packs a punch. Like any tower moment would. Next, I'm going to do the star. So I'm going to do Tarot of the Moon Garden for this one, which I know is a little bit of an interesting depiction because it is so dark. But this is my star deck because of the way that I use it to plan for my gardening. So I got this deck in January, February when the world was very pared back and very bleak. And I used this deck to help me envision or dream of the lushness of my garden to come and to make plans for it and to hope for a better future. And so after everything has been stripped back by winter, this is the deck that I want to go to give me light, to give me guidance, and to give me direction on where to go next. So the Tarot of the Moon Garden is my star deck. Now, in terms of my moon deck, I'm going to have to go ahead and pick the Mystical Dream Tarot, which is one of my top favorite tarot decks of all time. So this reminds me a lot of the moon because the creator of this deck pulled all of this imagery from her own dreams. So everything that you're seeing here, she claims in the guidebook that she dreamed before. And so she used this deck to convey essentially her dreams to the rest of the world and to try to fit it within the larger scope of tarot imagery. But if it couldn't fit in, she was okay with that because she thought that this imagery was worthwhile sharing to the world. And so I think that the fact that this deck has its origins in those dreams speaks of the moon. It speaks of things that we might not immediately see, things that we have to shine light on in order to get a better understanding of it, but even stuff that when you shine light on it, you know, the moon always has a shadow. So you're not ever really going to be able to see the whole picture. It is something that is slippery and something that is illusory in nature. I also love it for the moon card, for cards like this. So this is the sun. So I think after your body has died in death, I've spoken about the rest of the Fool's Journey in a way that is more spiritual and archetypal. So essentially you're raising and you're finding that higher form of ascension. So by the time you get to a sun, you don't have a body anymore. You already lost your body with death. So I like the fact that this deck doesn't have any figures in it, in like the sun and the moon cards, because I think it brings on that idea of there's knowledge that is higher up in the major arcana. You know, arcana means secrets that we can't really unlock until we ascend to that next point in our journey. So, you know, we don't need to put people in it. We don't need the people at all because the people aren't there. And so the fact that it's willing to tap into those, what I consider to be truths, what are the secrets of the major arcana, remind me of the moon, because you have to work for it. And it might be something that is not immediately within your understanding. It might be, you know, a swampy secret per se. But if you work hard at it and you look to the shadow sides of things and you look deeper into the meanings of things, you're able to see its purpose. Not to mention, on a superficial note too, this is one of the only decks that I own that has a bunch of water. So of course it had to be with the receptivity of the moon. So next would be the fifth spirit for my sun deck. So when I think of the sun, I think of you coming to the point in your life where you've become self-actualized. So you're living for your own truth, and that truth radiates from within you. And so I have to pick the fifth spirit because of the way that it depicts different types of people living their truth and radiating that beauty. And so of course the Emperor here, it's clear that this is someone who is probably not cisgender, but there's someone who is like willing to show their chest and bear that chest to the world. And so I think that all of the figures that are depicted within this deck are people that have done a lot of thinking about themselves and who they are, and have worked through whatever they need to work through, to have a high level of self-confidence, and to be willing to be upfront and to be honest with the world. And so I think that there's nothing more beautiful than people living in their own truth. This is a great example of it with the Page of Pentacles, and radiating that sense of self onto the world. So there's that sense of self-actualization, of radiating, of know exactly who you are, of sunlight after dark days. That makes the fifth spirit remind me of the Sun Tarot, or the Sun card. Next is going to be Judgment. So I had already spoken on previously with the hierophant of the types of people that are from Acadiana that are known as traitors, that work with plant medicine and also with like traditional Catholicism to bring healing to people. So if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that working with herbalism is something that I really love. And so this Judgment deck is a little bit personal to me, because it reminds me of my higher purpose to not only learn about plants and plant native plants, but also to teach other people about them. I am a teacher, that's what I do as a profession. So I really like that this deck is set up to where every single plant can teach you, or every single card can teach you about a particular plant. So this deck reminds you of my higher purpose. But I also like in the deck how much it talks about healing not only yourself, but other people as well. So it reminds me that for most of us, like, our higher purpose is to not only engage with ourselves, but to engage with other people. So Herbcrafters continually reminds me to do more, to do better, to listen to my inner truth, and to heed the call to live out my passions and to share them with other people in a positive way. And the last is going to be my World deck. So this is the Green Witch Tarot. I did edge mine, albeit not very great. But the Green Witch Tarot is going to be my World deck. So when I think about the World card, I think about the fact that it has a earthly elemental alignment. And so it reminds me of things that are all green. And of course, you know, the World card reminds me of the Earth. Totally makes sense, because that's the Earth's name. But when we pull the World card in just everyday readings, not ones that are spiritual per se, but just everyday daily pulls, we're reminded of the fact that a cycle has become completed, and it's time to really soak in that achievement and that celebration of all of your efforts. And so the Green Witch Tarot reminds me of that, because these are a group of villagers who have each other's backs, who are always there for each other. And I imagine that all of these characters are people that would cheer you on once you've reached that point in your life to where you are celebrating a massive achievement. And so there's a warmth to this deck. I also like to think about, I read one time that in terms of traditional imagery, I'm going to pause 1 second so I can grab a card. The dancer that is depicted on this card is the Fool. And so essentially this circular shape, or this oval shape, is the vagina, and the Fool is about to go through that and be reborn again, and to do all of the adventures of the Fool's Arcana again. And so when I think about it in terms of this, of like a traditional World card, I'd like to think that everyone in this deck would be willing and would be helping the Fool to begin again. And so they're providing that community and that comfort to the Fool so that he can start those adventures once more and learn from them once more. So this was Katie at Moonflower Moments. I really appreciate you sticking around as I completed this video response to Waves of Your Soul Tarot. So I hope that all of you have a wonderful day, and that you're able to have your own Fool's adventures. So thank y'all so much, and I'll see you next time.